This episode's topic of discussion is Roberto Bolaño's novel By Night in Chile, first published in Spanish in the year 2000 and then translated into English under new directions 3 years later. By Night in Chile is the deathbed confession of one Sebastián Urrutia Lacroix, an Opus Dei priest and leading critic of the Chilean literary scene. In one 130-page paragraph, Lacroix recounts his experiences with and influence on Chilean literature, and he attempts to account for his silences, or moments when he was complicit in the era of political violence leading up to and during Augusto Pinochet's tenure as head of state. Pinochet was not surprisingly backed by the United States of America and was a right-wing general opposed to the former socialist democratic president Salvador Allende. Throughout the dreamlike and unstable narrative, Lacroix is accosted by a figure known only as the Wizened Youth, someone who takes Lacroix to task for his complicity and who may be a stand-in for Roberto Bolaño himself. In weaving together narrative conceit and actual historical figures, of which Lacroix is also a thinly disguised reference to, Bolaño makes us question the nature of literature in relation to political violence and state power. What's the point of reading and writing in the face of government atrocity? Does literature mean anything? Bolaño gives us no easy answers. As an essay entitled On Bolaño, published in N+1 magazine, states, in Bolaño, literature is a helpless, undignified, and not especially pleasant compulsion, like smoking. At one point, you started and now you can't stop. It's become a habit and an identity. Nothing is so consistent across Bolaño's work as the suspicion that literature is chiefly bullshit, rationalizing the misery, delusions, and our narcissism of various careerist flakes and losers. Yet Bolaño somehow also treats literature as his and his characters' sole excuse for existing. This basic Bolaño aporia, literature is all that matters, literature doesn't matter at all, can be a glib paradox for others. He seems to have meant it sincerely, even desperately, something one would feel without knowing the first thing about his life. We are joined on this episode by author Geoffrey D. Morrison, whose presence was greatly appreciated in talking about this strange and unsettling little book. We hope you enjoy the conversation. Welcome back, listeners, to the Infinite Library podcast, a podcast about books, mortality, and what to do with your limited time with both. I'm your host, Ben.
And I'm John.
And today we have a very special guest, Geoffrey D. Morrison, a author and a critic. He's a writer based in Vancouver, Canada. His debut novel, Falling Hour, was published last year with Coach House Books. Welcome to the pod, Geoffrey. Really glad to have you.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
And so today we're going to discuss Roberto Bolaño's novel By Night in Chile. Now, I wanted to ask you guys this partly because I have a story I want to tell. But Geoffrey, what was your experience, Roberto Bolaño? I feel like he's a guy everybody kind of knows about, and they have usually like some intense experience with him, either if they like him or not. So what was your first? How did you hear of him?
I heard of him as I have with a lot of books from my friend Matthew Tompkinson, who he's sort of been a past like collaborator of mine. We wrote a book of short stories together a few years ago called Archaic Torso of Gumby. And Matt is just someone with like incredible taste, and a lot of the time I've just sort of like followed after him, picked up on what he has enjoyed. And so that was how I first heard about Bolaño. And I think I started with Savage Detectives. And I remember really distinctly that I read that book when I was probably about 25, 26. And I was in a kind of weird, like transitional state in my life where I had like dropped out of a graduate program. And I was like, at the time thinking that I was going to be writing poetry, and I write fiction now. So I totally made, yet another like change. But and I remember, well, first of all, like the first section with Juan Garcia Madero, like this precocious, like almost like Paul Bunyan of like eating lots of food and writing many poems. Like I love that so much. And then like you know when you get to that second section of that book, and you see these characters kind of like almost like aging before your eyes. I was sort of like terrified, but also like really compelled. And I feel like it's a book that you can return to so many times, and you'll like identify different things each time you look at it. So that's how it started, and I've been pretty obsessed ever since.
Yeah,
Yes.
excellent. John, do you want to go? Because I have the story I've been saving, but I want to pass the ball to you. So
my story is actually not too different from Geoffrey's story, except instead of his friend Ben, it was you.
Oh wow!
I feel like at some point when we were like in undergrad, or maybe like a couple years after, you were reading either 2666 or Savage Detectives, and you were like, John, I'm reading this really cool book. You got to check it out. You're like, you told me all about like visceral realism. And I was like, wow, man, that sounds cool. And then I looked up the book and I saw that it was like 1,000 pages. And I was like, I can't do this right now. And then, yeah, like you said, Ben, Bolaño is one of those guys where I feel like even if you haven't read him, you know of him, at least if you're like, again, kind of in that space that I feel like you and I are pretty familiar with, where you're like, you're not reading like exclusively like indie lit, but like you're like beneath the surface of like kind of mainstream like popular literature. Yeah. So you're kind of hearing about like, I don't know, like Mark Fisher and stuff like that. Especially like, yeah, if you're kind of like on the leftier side, like we were at that time, you know, you're going to hear about Bolaño because obviously he was, if you want left wing literature from like someone who actually like lived his truth, as the kids say, Bolaño's one of them. But yeah, this is actually my second Bolaño ever. I still have not read 2666 or Savage Detectives, but I've read his more metafictional book. I guess they're all a little metafictional, but his kind of like big metafictional book, Nazi Literature in the Americas, which I read last year on kind of a metafiction kick I was having, and I really, really liked that. So I was really excited to get into something and to see like what he can do, like when he's working like on a very sparse level. Yeah. So yeah, very interesting kind of contrast, and really shows like how much range this guy had.
Yeah, and so I also want to say too, it's interesting. I'll tell my story, but I do want to say it's interesting that like By Night in Chile was one of the first ones to get translated into English, because I feel like it's the most Chilean specific. And I think like the ones that, like, as we were saying, we ended up reading first are like a little broader, but still specific. And when I had read 2666, and I remember telling you about the line in there where he's describing a community college, and he's like, it's like a cemetery that tried to think or something. And I remember like just being blown away by that. And then like, and then I read Savage Detectives, and it felt like I got like electrocuted, because I was like, I need to start a zine. And I think that ended up like it was in a similar time we were talking, Geoffrey, where you're kind of like in between states. And I was like, I'm going to start a zine. And like, we started a zine, and I was like, it's going to be just like the Visceral Realists. And like, obviously like it ended up something different. But like, the other thing that I think is interesting about Bolaño is I feel like for a lot of people, he sort of presents different ways of doing fiction than for whatever reason we've heard of. And I think some of those attributes are like people who speak to you directly, like speakers that speak to you directly, a merging of like fact and fiction, an obsession with literature as like a sort of way of life kind of, and also just weird poetic metaphors that he'll just kind of do and not have you like worry about if you like understand them exactly. Like there's a kind of like commitment to being a poet. Like you'd mentioned, he was a poet first, and then he decided to write prose. And so when I took a couple classes for I think it was like a fiction writing certificate, and my MFA teacher, he was a great teacher, but he's, you know, very committed to the like what you'd think of as the standard MFA short story school, where characters have revelations and you can take something away. And I kept badgering him. I was like, please read Roberto Bolaño. I want to write like Roberto Bolaño. Please read him. And he was like, oh, you know. And then later I went to my friend who was in the MFA program, gave a reading, and I was there, and I saw him, and I was like, hey, did you read By Night in Chile? And this just horrible thing passes across his face, and his entire demeanor changes, and he goes like, it's settling, little book. Like, and then he just gets like whisked away. Like he literally gets whisked away. Like, and I was like, yes. So, like, and I still don't know like what like it even happened, but his entire like pallor changed. And I think it's like there's a lot going on in this book, but I think like that was like what I wanted, kind of, and I felt like, yeah,
You lived through like a moment that would happen in a Roberto Bolaño story.
Yeah, totally. It's so worthy of the book.
Yeah, and he was just like unsettled, and then that was it. So I don't know. I just, it's interesting to me that he represents like this other way of doing fiction that I think for whatever reason we haven't encountered before, and I don't know. That's why I'm excited to talk about him. That's partly why I like him so much. So
yeah, absolutely. Like I said, like this is not like a huge book. My edition clocks in at like 118 pages, like practically a novella, honestly. But there's a lot here to discuss. Like, honestly, this gives some longer books we've read kind of a run for their money in terms of just density.
So it should be noted real quick, because I think in By Night in Chile, he's kind of talking directly about a period of upheaval that he lived through in some ways. And so to just give real brief background on Bolaño, he was born in 1953 in Santiago, Chile, and his family moved to Mexico City in 1968. And he had dropped out of school and then decided to become a journalist, and he got kind of involved with like left-wing political causes. Importantly, this kind of relates to the book. He went back to Chile in 1973, as he says, to help build the revolution, because basically Salvador Allende was running for president, and he was basically a democratic socialist. And then, as we all know, there was a coup based on the military that the USA and the CIA supported, and General Pinochet essentially took power. And according to Bolaño, he was imprisoned for 8 days. Now, whether or not this happened seems like it's up for speculation. Regardless, Bolaño wrote about it extensively. And in By Night in Chile, he's, rather than writing from the perspective of like a poet scholar, a sort of young poet like in Savage Detectives or in other books, he writes from a sort of person who is complicit in the power changeover that happened at that time. It is his full name is Sebastian Lacroix. He is a priest and a member of Opus Dei, is the main character who speaks in By Night in Chile. And I think sort of in writing about this, Bolaño is attempting to kind of like take people who are responsible for this changeover who happen to be involved in literature, because the priest was also he had a pen name where he was a critic, and then his actual name he wrote poetry under. And Bolaño is kind of taking these people to task basically for what happened. And I think that kind of gets where he's coming from this. And, we could mention that he eventually goes back to Europe and kind of settles in Barcelona. Bolaño does, and writes fiction. But that's kind of like, I think, his life experience that's coming to bear on this. So.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Ben.
I mean, with Bolaño, you never know exactly what's going on. There's always some true elements and some fictive elements.
Yeah. So like Ben said, the book is told from the viewpoint of Father Arias, I think is how it's pronounced, which is the pen name of Sebastian Lacroix that he wrote criticism under, Urrutia. He's a Chilean priest, member of Opus Dei, like Ben said, and he comes from kind of a mixed upper class background. He's pretty crucially, I think, completely European, at least as he portrays himself, and he, is someone I think Bolaño kind of initially has a lot of maybe sympathy for, in terms of he's a very educated, literate young man who really wants to write, and he falls into kind of this literary circle around this much more established critic, of which Pablo Neruda and some other like very establishment poets are members of, and he just kind of gets swept along the tides of the literary and political worlds throughout his life. The book starts with him actually as an old man. This is kind of like the whole book is basically like a manic, like dying man's monologue as he's like kind of his life's flashing before his eyes. And crucially, there are no paragraph breaks anywhere. It's all one paragraph technically. Yeah. So which really I think kind of heightens the mental state this guy's supposed to be in. So he gets swept along kind of in this tide. And eventually he kind of falls in with, through these connections he's made, he falls in with this coup plot Specifically, he is tasked by two guys who are heavily implied to be like intelligence assets, probably for the CIA, to teach the incoming military junta, including General Pinochet, the basics of Marxist theory, so that they can better perpetrate the atrocities they are planning to do to the country's left-wing movements. And he does that, and then he becomes very unpopular for a little while, and then kind of as the coup happens and life returns to normal for him, his life just kind of goes on. He never becomes like a huge success. He never becomes like kind of this literary icon that maybe he dreamed of being. And again, we come to him in his old age when he's clearly like ridden with guilt for what he did, and he's trying to process what he's done. And yeah, it's another one of these books that doesn't have any easy answers at the end of it, except maybe don't help a military coup.
Yeah, and I think I like that you pointed out that he's European because he has this sort of weird hatred for the people. And Geoffrey, you had actually read it in Spanish, and you had pointed out, I think it was the word patria, I believe.
Patria, yeah.
Yeah, patria, yeah. So, and you had found something interesting about that where you mentioned like sort of it reveals kind of his position.
Yeah, there's a couple of notes on that because, yeah, he really wants to emphasize to you he's European. His ancestry is Basque and French. There's that weird moment where he kind of says, okay, my mother's ancestral village in France was called either Man on the Earth or Standing Man, and I can't remember which. And I remember, like, I made a note about this. As with so many things with Bolaño, you get the sense that this is very important, but you really don't know why. And that's like that's the prevailing feeling I always have when I read him. And I kind of read Bolaño almost for that feeling a lot of the time. But there's something about like, and I think there was a Spanish language critic who talked about this too, where like implicitly in the book there's this thing about, maybe Bolaño himself said it, the idea of Chile as a country that is, you know, a kind of post-colonial country that did also have like settler colonists like Urrutia Lacroix. Like it's more of a landscape than a place. And this word patria is really interesting in that context because so it sort of means like literally it's like fatherland. Now it's not exclusively a word of the right because Salvador Allende's campaign song Venceremos, which means like we will win. It's a beautiful song actually. They use the word too, but every time they do, it's always linked with, okay, the workers of the country, the women of the country, all of the people that whose aspirations are kind of tied up in the victory of Allende, the socialist president. And every time Urrutia Lacroix says the word, it's always in this really abstracted way, totally like remove, almost as though what he loves is like a country without people. And it's really borne out too in all of his interactions with farmers, with the rural poor people who live on the land of his kind of benefactor, this creepy guy Farewell. And like anytime the kind of peasantry meet the priest and ask him, you know, oh, will you give us some help? There's a sick child or something. He's so contemptuous of them. Yeah. Almost like doesn't care. And it seems so revealing, and like it's a recurring theme. Like we can kind of see that he's comfortable in the abstraction of saying, I live in a wonderful country, but confronted by like the realities of the people who live in it, he's sort of always kind of disgusted.
Yeah. And I also like that you mentioned his interactions because like he became a priest very early. And when he's talking to these rural guys that live on the land, they keep going, son, I mean, father, because he's wearing his like cassock. So there's like this kind of like strange disconnection, and like, and he's like sort of disgusted, and like some of the like horror almost happens in those passages where he's kind of like confronted with the reality of like the people that live in the country, not like just the literature of the country, which he's sort of obsessed with, like, and he can't reconcile those two, and he kind of like retreats into it. So
he has this like idealized idea of like, oh, I'm part of the Chilean literati with Pablo Neruda, and with his critic friend, and like we are defining like the culture of this this young country.
Yeah.
I don't know exactly when Chile got independence, but I assume kind of when this book is taking place, it's somewhere around like the centennial of the country's independence. So still very much a country finding its voice, at least for these people, and he thinks that I'm going to be part of this movement defining what being Chilean means, and then he meets these peasants, and it's like, well, these people have nothing to do with what me and all my cool friends are doing.
Yeah.
These are dirt people, and I really just wish that they would stop talking to me or die.
Yeah.
Yeah, and importantly too, LaCroix and Farewell, which we could talk about, are like kind of right wing Christian guys, and Neruda, famously left wing, sort of a populist poet, actually worked with Allende. And I think it's interesting in Bolaño, like he doesn't get too, I mean, the politics are obviously really important, but I think he likes to just kind of put these characters together and sort of have you deduce what the meaning of it is. And I think like ideally, like kind of like they're coming together under the banner of literature and they're going to put political differences aside. But as the book shows, when he falls in with like CIA agents, those differences do matter. And they are like, it is kind of like a matter of life and death at times to kind of be complicit with this and not say anything.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I think that's really the central critique of the novel. Like, this is a novel being written towards like a literary audience.
Yeah.
And it's saying that I understand, Bolaño's saying, listen, I know you think that literature is the most important thing in your life and that politics is somehow dirty or beneath you, or a matter for the mud people. But thinking that way, making aesthetics like the only thing in your life that matter, is either going to make you complicit in atrocity, or it's like Neruda, maybe going to make you look like a bit of a coward, like in retrospect.
Well, Neruda kind of like, I don't know if you guys saw this on the Wikipedia page about him, like whether or not he was poisoned.
Like, I've always suspected he was. Yeah.
Yeah. Like Neruda, like, I don't know. Yeah. It's, I had mentioned earlier that like when I had read this, I had also read Distant Star, which came around this time. And the character who kind of stands in for Bolaño that says that like he had Neruditis, where like Neruda was such like an impactful poet that he was like, I don't want to read this guy. And I think it's like, it's interesting that he's in this book. And like at the first scene where, LaCroix is talking about going to Farewell's estate for the first time, he sees Neruda like addressing like the moonlight and saying a poem, and LaCroix goes like, does the wizened youth have stories like this? I think not. Because like the wizened youth is like constantly berating him, and sort of, as John said, this kind of manic death dying dream. Like he's like this wizened youth keeps saying, like yelling at him that he's to blame, and he's like, I'm not to blame. Everything's fine. My conscience is clear. And as we've been talking, it's not. So
the Neruda thing is also really, it's fascinating because so when I was doing kind of some reading on some like Spanish secondary sources and stuff for this, so Farewell was actually also based on a real guy. It's just that his pseudonym was Alone instead of Farewell. Seriously. And I found photos of him. He looked terrifying. He looked like a skeleton mixed with an eagle, and he genuinely had exactly the same life trajectory as the Farewell of the book. Like, he was son of wealthy landowners, very, very right wing, anti-communist, deeply closeted, and supporter of Pinochet, and died peacefully at 92, which seems to happen to a lot of these like right wing figures. I mean, even the guy that Urrutia Lacroix was based on is, if I remember right, still alive. I think either still alive or like died recently. And this guy who Alone, the real Farewell, according to some sources, may have actually provided the money for Neruda to get his first book published.
Oh yes,
Which is fascinating, because again, it's like there's this sort of maybe the figure of being the patron and the kind of like reflected light that shines on you, even though you're not Neruda. You can say, I gave him some money. And there's that moment that's so fascinating in the early days after the coup, because Neruda died just like a handful of days after the coup, Farewell and Urrutia Lacroix are phoning each other, and they say something like, well, Pablo's died of cancer. Oh, yes, of course, of cancer. And it's almost like implicitly we kind of know that they know that it wasn't cancer and that he had to be dealt with. But there's this, it's so chilling and so like,
it's really matter of fact. It's like the Irishman phone call when he's like calling him to tell him like, oh, like Jimmy Hoffa didn't make it. Like it's almost like brutal in how matter of fact it is. Yeah.
And honestly, that's a kind of an amazing comparison in a way, because the same, like when you think about like, De Niro's character and Hoffa, there's this like intimacy that they kind of like, it's like, he's my best friend and I'm going to kill him now. And there's something like that's almost seemingly how a lot of these relationships play out, where like there's this sort of warped affection, and that seems to be how they feel, or at least how Farewell feels about Neruda, and it kind of plays out in some other places too. With
crucially, there's never like they're never like, oh, that Neruda, like he's a bit of like a left wing like fruitcake or something like that. It's always they're always very like deferential and affectionate towards him until he dies of cancer.
Exactly. And then they just say, oh, he died, like it's so matter of fact. And I think that like the patron angle is good too, because I think LaCroix as a critic sort of, he's like, I'm the one who found these poets, I'm the responsibility of building Chilean literature. Like I was who is the it's like Nicanor Parra, I think.
Oh, Nicanor Parra, he's amazing.
He's like, I was talking about him early, and like and like he keeps reminding you. That's another great thing about Bolaño. He's always gives you so much in terms of like references to other things. And so like LaCroix is constantly saying, I turned people onto this guy, as if like he's as important as the people that wrote it.
It's like James Murphy in that LCD Sound System song, where it's like, I was there.
I was there telling them to read Parra. They never believed me. They said he wouldn't make a dime. And so like it's almost like I'm the one who gets the light on this.
Again, maybe in the circles that Urrutia is moving in, it is almost as important, because he's hanging out with all these critics. Like he's crucially, like, again, he's not interacting with the mass public much, even though he's a priest. I found that's something I find really interesting in this book is the fact that he is a priest. Like he theoretically like has a job. And there are points where that does come into play, and we can talk about some of those. I found the church tour he gets to go on very interesting.
I know.
Well, do you want to jump to the church tour? I feel like it really makes sense to do that.
So a little setup. The church tour starts off. This is about midway through the book. He is connected through kind of his literary scene connections to two very strange men named Mr. Ita and Mr. Reef.
Mr. Fear and Mr. Hate.
Yes. Who, again, it's never spelled out entirely, but it's pretty obvious that these guys are CIA agents who are in Chile, basically casing the joint for the coming heist coup for Allende. And Urrutia, again, kind of bumbles in with them, and they tell him like, oh, we have this great opportunity for you. We're connected with the church, and the church really needs someone to go over to Europe and tour all these old cool churches and hear about how they've managed to preserve them and like renovate them over the years. And Urrutia is like, oh, shucks, that sounds great. And so
he says like, it was the thing for me. Like literally,
and he gets like this insane stipend to go over there, like, and basically go meet with all these priests who, run all these, again, beautiful old medieval churches in Europe and talk about preservation. So he gets over there, and this is honestly one of the strangest parts of the book, in my opinion. Like, this is the part where I finished the book, and I was just like sitting there, and I was literally puzzling over like this particular bit. He goes over there, and every priest he meets, I think we probably like actually see him like meet with 3 people.
Yeah.
I can't remember them all off the top of my head, but they're all engaged in falconry.
Yeah, almost without fail. The only place where they don't is Madrid, and that's where he has to do something else important that he doesn't tell us about, which I feel like is so much is like under that. But yeah.
But basically these priests are like, the biggest like threat to the church is pigeon shit. And so all these priests have taken up falconry so that they can basically have all the pigeons around their churches killed to keep the waves of bird shit from ruining the buildings. And this is kind of getting into like what Ben was saying about like Bolaño and his kind of unique style and like the way he does fiction. As I was reading this, like it's pretty clear that like what they're again the degree to which this is a metaphor is very unclear.
Yeah.
Like you said, Geoffrey, he says at one point in Madrid he has to go do something that he doesn't tell us about, something very important, but he doesn't, even though this is like his own monologue, like he won't confront whatever it is that happened in Madrid.
Yeah.
But I found myself thinking like this is clearly like a metaphor for, the church is employing falcons, basically, military aristocrats of one stripe or another to protect the edifice of the Catholic Church writ large from pigeons, which are normal people, workers and peasants.
What did we think about the bit where the falcon kills the national mascot of a sports team at one of the churches they're visiting, which is crucially a dove? What do we think is going on there? Because it's almost like a really kind of darkly comedic, but like really upsetting and kind of like the implications are really dark. It's like a scene that happens. So what do we think of that?
It's not just like a local mascot, like the dove. Like Ben, you and I went to Catholic school for years. That's literally like the symbol of the Holy Spirit and peace. Like that is the church loosing again like the forces of like secular like power on God himself. But also like something I found myself wondering, like, is this a metaphor or is he like actually like concealing what he was really talking with these priests about, which was actually about the literal suppression, but then he's putting it into a metaphor now in his old age to again conceal what he actually did. Because I can't really believe that the CIA would actually pay him to go to Europe just to do this,
just to hang out.
Well, you're right. There's that moment when he gets a letter from, I can't remember if it's Mr. Fear or Mr. Hate, that's describing in incredibly like bland terms, like, oh, you must be having a nice time in Europe, huh? Hope you're enjoying all the lovely food, and he's like, well, it was as though there was like a letter superimposed on another letter. Sometimes I feel like with Bolaño we have to read the whole thing that way. But the crazy thing is, like, I feel like it could still be both. I always get that feeling like they literally could be just also engaged in falconry, and at the same time, like, there's something else behind that. The thing that I was kind of thinking about too is that Bolaño has this. It surfaces in a few different books where, like, and I was sort of thinking that it's something that makes him, in a lot of ways, like, you can tell that he had a poetry background. When he'll sort of break with narrative and he will just dump information, and like earlier in the book there's that thing where they start listing popes, which is also again hilarious and linked, I mean, even thematically, right? And they just are kind of sitting there like, what about this pope, what about this one, tell me about this one. Kind of similarly, like in Savage Detectives near the end, they're quizzing Garcia Madero on all these incredibly abstruse poetic forms that no one's used since like the 16th century, and they're like, tell us about an Alexandrian, and it's long, it's so long, but it's something that he kind of loves to do. And it's the same thing almost, where it's like you have this weird almost like constraint poem structure, and then I met a priest called Gilbert and his falcon called Ronnie, or whatever it was.
They do have really strange names too. They're like kind of comedic names of the falcons also. Well, and I'm glad you brought up the list thing too, because I think one, that shows that like Bolaño is kind of fearless in a way that he's giving information that only the characters really like. And he's like, I know the reader is either going to pull something out of this that I can't anticipate, or they're just going to have to deal with it because this character like honestly believes in what they're saying. Yeah. Additionally, if you ever read The Third Reich, there's lists of board game moves.
Oh yeah.
Where and they make no sense. It's like I moved here and he moved there. I moved there and he moved there. And it's like literally for pages. And two, I think like again, it's almost like it's like an epic list, or it's like the fact that you can put other things in a book that don't have to be standard narrative conventions is like that's his like kind of surrealist poetry, or I guess he's like post surrealist, but his sort of like weird poetry background that you could put things in poems that aren't normally there.
Well, I feel like something like we're kind of talking around here too is just that the reason Bolaño feels so like different from like you were saying, Ben, what makes Bolaño feel so different from like Anglo-American fiction? And I think that it's the fact that he is South American. Like he's writing in really a different tradition to some degree, and it doesn't always maybe feel that way like to us, because we kind of live in the metropole and it's like, oh, everything just comes here and we kind of get to read all of it. But it's, when you're talking about like the board game moves that don't make sense, like that's Borges. The kind of cloaking things in metaphor that of questionable like literality is like very much like him writing in kind of like the magical realist mode, and really kind of taking that to the next step, the next stage of that kind of form.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's what I really appreciate about Bolaño is that he is kind of synthesizing all these various streams and really, I think, pushing them forward in a way that, there are plenty of people who are still trying to write magical realist, or Borgesian fiction. But Bolaño really feels like he takes that stuff, and rather than just kind of riffing on it, like he's really moving forward with it in like a new way.
Yeah. It's part of what makes him still feel so current. Like I sometimes find it hard to believe that he died in 2003, because even like the board game stuff, there's so many ways that like the board games and the info dumping, it's like he anticipated kinds of people that we see on the internet, or like kinds of Nazi literature in the Americas especially. It's like that's probably one of the most like here's a bunch of types of guy books that has ever been.
Absolutely.
And so like in the 90s, like the internet was in its infancy. I wonder the extent to which it was even a thing he interacted with, or if he just like read about it and used his imagination. It's something that like it just everything of his I read, it astonishes me, because it makes him still feel so current. Like and I think speaking too to like the kind of Spanish language traditions he is sort of playing with, I kind of coincidentally today I was in an online lecture. There was a professor at the University of Burgos who was giving a lecture, and it was a free lecture that I tuned into. It was really good. The thing he really emphasized was that Cervantes, like with Don Quixote, is like already doing meta literature in 1604. And already calling all of those things into question. So like the Spanish language novel tradition is born basically doing these things and like saying, oh, everything I'm telling you is maybe not real. I may be tricking you a lot. And I love that. I mean, for me, that's just like, it really makes all of this worthwhile to like read.
Yeah. Whereas like the Anglo tradition, it's like we started with Tristram Shandy and Clarissa, and we decided to go with Clarissa, much to our detriment.
I know. It's a real like which way Anglophone.
Which way Western man.
I know. They picked the wrong door that time.
Like you were saying, Geoffrey, like I'm kind of like Bolaño is a purveyor of types of guys.
Oh yeah.
I'm gonna get a little spicy here, and I'm gonna say, like, as I was reading through this, I found myself thinking so much about like trad cats, like the modern like trad cat phenomenon.
So on point.
Yeah, like Urrutia is almost like kind of an example of that for me, except like obviously like most modern trad cats, at least in America, like none of them are actually going to join the church in terms of like becoming a priest. That's a little like too far for them. They're a little too wrapped up in the cult of the domestic.
Right.
But I think that still like this idea of like the Catholic Church as an institution that you enter into for like this sense of like aesthetic cleanliness and order is very much like in line with like what I see when I look at like trad cath people today. Like they go to church not because they believe in God or because they have any interest in deeper questions about like theology or again, even just like living as a Christian. They go because it's like, oh, once a week I get to go into an old building and not be around dirty people.
Well, and I think also there's a hint that LaCroix himself really doesn't believe, because when he's talking about the one elderly priest who is like, should we be killing pigeons? And that priest dies and he goes, maybe he was in heaven or in hell. He was probably in the cemetery. And I feel like that's the one admission that LaCroix is like, or LaCroix is like not really like, it's like the priest thing is not important. It's like, he's clearly in it for something else.
No, so. he joins the church, like he enters the seminary when he's like 13, but it never seems like he believes in God. He does it because it's a like respectable place where he can pursue his real love, which is literature, in like a country that doesn't seem to have like a very well-developed intelligentsia at that point. Like he can't necessarily like go be a university professor, but he also can't move to Europe and like kind of, or, you know, even like the United States and like immerse himself in like kind of a more traditional intellectual space. So the church becomes a way for him to enter, you know, the orbits of people like Farewell, in a way that he probably couldn't have if he'd just gone to like regular school.
Yeah. And there's a sense too, like whenever he's in some kind of discomfort, we get it. We're always sort of told he's praying. He's telling us he's praying. Never really explains, you know, the nature of the praying. It's all, you can just imagine him like white knuckling it, you know, that it's been useful for him insofar as there are like exercises, spiritual exercises, I guess, that he can take on for himself to feel a little bit better. But like, because he's also like in such like a constant state of discomfort. And I think like, I mean, that's such a Bolaño specialty too, is just like kind of sort of unhappy, discontented little guys like that are usually on the right. Bolaño is so good at like writing that kind of person. There's so many examples of it.
Yeah. Do you remember? He also thought of me. I don't remember the character's name, but do you remember the guy who always quotes Latin in Savage Detectives? And he's the guy who like sees Arturo Bolaño, the sort of Bolaño stand-in, and that's when Bolaño goes into that hole and pulls that person out. And then the Latin guy's just like, you know, I write poetry too. And Arturo Bolaño is like, I don't want to talk to you. And he's like this like simmering like Latin, like I don't remember his character name, but it's such like a discontented sort of like, and I know he's like in the back half, I think, like when Arturo is in, I think, Spain or whatever, or Barcelona, but I don't know, that kind, that discontent and that sort of like taking refuge in this older thing because it's like pure somehow. I don't know, like,
there's so many.
It seems to be a Bolaño.
Even like earlier in Savage Detectives 2, there's the guy who is sort of dragged along to a nightclub and hates it when they're still in Mexico. He's a great one. There's also a little bit later, there's this Spanish writer who he's like this young kind of right-wing wonder kid who's sort of describing how his career trajectory has been so wonderful. And he's like, well, you need to ingratiate yourself with like an older reactionary man. And also, by the way, I write opinion columns for a right-wing newspaper, and like, just, you know, he's so like self-satisfied. He's like 28 years old and like full of self-regard, and he's like awful. And it just felt like probably a person that Bolaño had observed.
Well, even in this book, one of my favorite bits, kind of on like the topic of like right-wing guys like self-soothing with snobbery. There's the bit, I love it, when the revolution happens, when Allende gets elected, and he's like, I'm gonna go read the Greeks again. And it's one of my favorite bits. If I could read a bit, if you guys don't mind. All right, let me find the exact. It's a little hard to find exact lines in this book because there's no breaks anywhere. All right. They're the worst, said Farewell. They're probably all out in the streets celebrating Allende's victory. After a few hours, Farewell fell asleep in his chair. I tried to put him to bed, but he was too heavy, so I left him there. When I got back to my house, I went straight to my Greek classics. Let God's will be done, I said. I'm going to reread the Greeks. Respecting the tradition, I started with Homer, then moved on to Thales of Miletus, Xenophanes of Colophon, Alcmaeon of Croton, Zeno of Elea, wonderful. And then a pro-Allende general was killed, and Chile restored diplomatic relations with Cuba, and the national census recorded a total of 8,884,746 Chileans, and the first episode of the soap opera, The Right to be Born, was broadcast on television, and I read Tyrtaios of Sparta, and Archiliakos of Paros, and Solon of Athens, and Hipponax of Ephesus, and Stesichoros of Himera, and Sappho of Mytilene, and Anacreon of Teos, and Pindar of Thebes, one of my favorites. And the government nationalized the copper mines, and then the nitrate and steel industries, and Pablo Neruda won the Nobel Prize, and Diaz Casanueva won the National Literature Prize, and Fidel Castro came to visit, and many people thought that he would stay and live in Chile forever, and Perez Zujovic, the Christian Democrat ex-minister, was killed, and Lafourcade published White Dove, and I gave it a good review. You might say I hailed it in glowing terms, although deep down I knew it wasn't much of a book, and the very first Allende March was organized with the people banging pots and pans, and I read Aeschylus, and Sophocles, and Euripides, all the tragedies, and Alcaios of Mytilene, and Aesop, and Hesiod, and Herodotus, titan among authors. And then in Chile, there were shortages and inflation and black marketeering and long lines for food, and Farewell's estate was expropriated by the land reform along with many others, and the Bureau of Women's Affairs was set up, and so on and so on and so on.
Yeah, it's almost like delirious. Like,
yeah. Reading it out loud was actually a really interesting experience because I found myself like getting into the mania more than like when you're reading it just on the page. This would be like a really interesting book to see someone like do as like a one-man play.
I was just thinking that. I would see. I can almost imagine like Paul Giamatti doing it.
Oh, that'd be so good.
Yeah.
The Greeks.
Exactly.
I think it's like really crucial that like when left-wing politics are like in ascendancy, he's like, I gotta go back to the Greeks.
Yeah.
And it's just like he just bunkers down and is like reading Aeschylus as like good things are happening, but they're scary for him because he feels like all of a sudden he's no longer in control of Chile. Chile is like defining itself like by the will of the people he does not like. And he's no longer in control. Like even he says like White Dove got published and he gave it a good review, even though he didn't think it was a very good book. I think that just that little bit to me shows like how out of control he feels of like his world at that point. I don't know anything about White Dove, but I assume it's probably like a lefty novel.
Well, Pinochet also said he read it, and remember, like Pinochet is like, I do like to keep up on stuff or something. Like it's like, like
we got to talk about that bit. Yeah, that was one of my favorite scenes as well. Pinochet like sits him down and is like, "So what do you think Allende reads?" And Urrutia is like, I couldn't even pretend to know. And he's like, Pinochet's like, he reads magazines. And Urrutia is like, oh, no. And then Pinochet is like, not only do I read novels, I've written a few books. And Urrutia is like,
well, and the language goes, he looked at him like a wounded bird. Like LaCroix literally becomes like a pigeon that's being preyed on by like Allende the Falcon, but it's like in literature, like in the fact that supposedly Allende didn't read and Pinochet does, and he is like a critic,
which again I think goes to like Bolaño's broader point about like how you make art like all you have in the world, like you're going to be a mark for this kind of stuff.
And the other thing I want to say too about it almost gets like hilarious in another dark way when he's teaching the class and all they want to do is talk about female Chilean Marxist critic moment. Because they're obsessing with the fact that they're like, is she attractive? And like he's trying to teach the class, and like the generals are just fixated on this. Like it's like it's sort of shades of like weird misogyny happening at that moment, and you can imagine LaCroix like losing control of the class because like nobody's actually doing the reading, and they just end up like talking about this stuff, and then and that's when he sort of starts to feel guilty. about his complicity, but then he just kind of like stuffs it down, basically. Like he tells Farewell, like, did I do the right thing? And Farewell says, well, was it necessary or unnecessary? And LaCroix says it was necessary. And so they just kind of explain it away.
I mean, I think that
yeah,
like something that I kept kind of coming back to is like, even though Urrutia has found himself in kind of these very influential circles in a way, like he knows he's powerless to some degree. Like, I think that's where his need to like absolve himself comes from to some degree, is that he knows he couldn't like stop what was going on. He doesn't have any real power. He's a critic. He's just a critic who happens to be a useful dupe for these powerful right-wing fingers. But if he wasn't around, there'd be another one.
Right.
There's sort of like, yeah, he wasn't like gonna, he doesn't have like, he's not strong. He's not gonna like kill Pinochet, like sitting there. You can't do that, you know?
Yeah, it's interesting kind of seeing that in relation to like there was a huge sort of, in addition to the people that were persecuted on the left, there was also just a massive like exodus that he of course wasn't a part of. And it's like there's this sort of, it's another one of those moments where like implicitly he kind of knows that the well of literary culture such as it is in Chile post, in the years of the dictatorship is completely poisoned. The people that are sort of left are kind of like mediocre little creeps, but like he has to sort of like repress that fact especially when they're talking about the salons in that house in the suburbs, where there's sort of the fact of the absence is so clear all the way through, but it's like he can't really address that to the same level of like frankness that you can imagine some of the other people around him are.
Yeah, there's no Nerudas anymore.
No.
Did you so when we were doing some research for this, we found people actually talking about that specific house, and did you see that Perar was like getting in arguments with people and he got thrown out?
Yeah.
apparently there's this detail about it. Perar was like just like either he realized something was up or he was just being incorrigible, and they said don't let this guy in here again, basically. So we should say that towards the end of the book, basically the way LaCroix talks about it, he's like, well, we have to talk the surviving people in Chile during this dictatorship. So we meet at a literary salon, which is thrown by this woman. She's a, okay poet, okay writer. She has this nice big house.
Married to an American,
and we have parties where we talk about literature.
Does some nebulous import export stuff.
Yep.
Named Jimmy. Yeah. And again, this is classic Bolaño, as you're being described at this party, this like sense of unease sets in. And that's when, as you were saying, Geoffrey, he looks out the window and he's like, I should have said something about how there was a curfew that was imposed by the government and it didn't affect us. We were allowed to party as long as we wanted. And then it's revealed somebody says that they were drunk and they were looking for the bathroom, and they go in the basement of the building and there's a man tied up, completely blindfolded. And then that person just goes back upstairs and doesn't say anything, but then slowly tells other people. And then it's revealed that her husband was basically part of DINA, which was the secret police of Pinochet, which were also trained by the CIA, and he was torturing people in the basement while his wife was having literary parties there. And it's like, that's like the full sort of, I feel like that's when, if we're talking about like stuff going on at the surface, that's Bolaño like letting it rise to the top, basically, for almost like a jump scare. It almost feels like a jump scare, because the first time I read it, I think I was shook because I didn't see where it was coming, and I was like, holy crap, when it was revealed.
When like a full like horrifying image is shown to us, because everything else in this book, it's so rooted in Urrutia's like personal experience, which is uniformly like incredibly comfortable, apart from like the self-imposed like neuroses he has, that again, nothing bad ever happens to him. He never has to, he doesn't even see the sky. It's just described to him, but it's described in such a way that he can relate it to us as like kind of a story within a story. And yeah, we actually get to see the image, all the unease that's been building up in this book. Because like, I don't know about you guys, but I felt like more and more uneasy as the book went on, and then suddenly we get this moment of actually confronting the horror that like implicitly is going on in the background, but you can't see it until this moment.
Yeah, that it's something that really, the first time I read the book, I read it in the Chris Andrews translation. Second time I read it in the original, and just it's interesting to kind of compare, like, hey, look at the size difference between the two.
Oh, wow.
And this actually happens a lot when you translate from Spanish into English. Like, you can usually accomplish somewhat shorter sentence in English, for better or for worse. Because one of the things that reading it in Spanish really, like, emphasized for me was exactly that feeling of, like, circling around things. There's a way you can construct a sentence in Spanish that's very, like, relational, where you maybe don't use the direct, like, names of people necessarily. You don't have to use subject pronouns. Through this sort of intricate, like, webbing of, like, indirect object pronouns and direct object pronouns and things that, take me a while to get used to, you can very, like, indirectly sketch out a lot of complex relationships between, like, how I feel about this thing happened and how it, how it affected someone else. And that is so, like, apparent when you read this book in the original, that it's like this circling, slowly tightening screw that is really, like, incredible, like, and hard to escape.
Yeah, and as John had mentioned, it's like sort of one giant paragraph, and there are some sentences that run on quite long, and I imagine, like, in Spanish, it's sort of easier to write those kinds of sentences.
You're kind of allowed to more. It's something that it's just, I think, has always had more of a, like, precedent, and, like, he's by no means the only Spanish language writer to do it. But it's interesting because it, like, this also weirdly feels like him at his most like a Thomas Bernhard novel. I think something about, again, having this really, like, bilious character who's, like, just full of resentments and, like, self-justifying and, like, not feeling well. That's another kind of comfortable Bernhard area. And, like,
something's always some
wrong.
Physical ailment.
No one's ever like in the peak of their physical condition in a Bernhard book, but it's the same kind of thing. Like, and really, I think I can kind of see in a way why it was the first of his novels to be translated, because, and I don't really feel this myself, but I've always assumed that maybe Anglophone readers and critics might have perceived this one to be the most, like, mature, quote unquote, because, I mean, it is also really funny in a lot of ways, but unlike, say, Savage Detectives or 2666 or a lot of his other ones, there's less of the totally, like, go for broke outrageousness. It is a little more, like, tightly wound because the character is too. I'm curious,
as someone who's only really read Nazi literature in the Americas before this, which is kind of an outlier in his, I mean, it'd be an outlier in, like, almost anybody's bibliography, but obviously that's like, again, kind of this fake academic text, kind of surveying all these fake authors, and therefore is, like, written at this very far remove. This is obviously in first person, like, in basically a monologue. In any of his other work, does he ever revisit kind of this, maybe not monologue form, but, like, this first person mode? I know, like, Savage Detectives and 2666 like, switch viewpoints depending on the section you're in, but are those, like, third person or first person?
Well, one of the cool things about Savage Detectives is, like, it opens with, like, the first person sort of, like, young poet encountering the scene, and then the middle of the book is just thousands of first person, like, well, I wouldn't say thousands, but, like, many first person, like, basically, like, sort of like this, but they are different characters speaking in the first person, and they have different tics and they have different approaches, and then it goes back to the first person of the opening. And then in Distant Star and Amulet, more like it's all first person sort of narration, because I think he tends to like that kind of stuff in terms of, like, interiority, and he likes varying kind of the ways he does it.
Yeah, And I'm trying to remember now with 266 because it also has like distinct sections that are all kind of their own, of a piece. But is it all in third person? I should know this off the dome, but I don't.
It's like a 1,000 page novel. I'm not gonna hold it against you for not remembering exactly everything about it.
I think there are a couple moments. Like, do you remember when that guy who was like a middle manager for the Third Reich is talking, and he's talking in first person like for a long time, and he's like given a lot of space to explain himself, and of course he doesn't. Like, it's like there's a bit where like he's like trying to confirm if he's supposed to kill all these people, and the guy on the phone says, "Oh, we're never going to confirm that over a phone call." So then he like goes, "I guess I have to do it." Like, and then then it goes back to third person, and the guy who's hearing that story strangles him. So like he's like immediately punished for his transgression. But so I think there's a couple parts for first person, but a lot of it is third person, I think. So
Ben, at a certain point earlier in the conversation, you mentioned a character or a figure in the book, maybe more accurately, the wizened youth, and that's like a very like large presence throughout the novel. Urrutia kind of in his monologue references this figure like over and over again. And so, can you tell us a little bit about that? And so we can take the conversation in that direction.
So the sick priest, obviously, he's talking to you or himself, and he's like, "I have to account for my life." And what spurns him is that this wizened youth is constantly harassing him and yelling at him and telling him that he's made a mistake and that he's complicit and he doesn't know what he's doing. And so periodically he returns to the wizened youth. As he says, like when he saw Neruda, he's like, "I bet the wizened youth doesn't have these stories." And then as it goes on, there's more details about the wizened youth that kind of align with what we know of Roberto Bolaño. And then at the end, he more or less says that the wizened youth is me. And so there's a couple ways we could take this. We could take it as this is Roberto Bolaño, either fictional Roberto Bolaño or actual Roberto Bolaño critiquing this kind of character. We could take him as just his conscience, and his conscience is still there saying like, you messed up, you blew it, and he's trying to address it, and that he should have done something. Importantly, actually, too, when they visit the woman who having the torture parties at her house, she says, "This is how literature is made in Chile." And LaCroix says, "This is how literature is made everywhere." And then the wizened youth says, "No." And that's like the one time the wizened youth says something, he just says no. Yeah. And so at the end, he finally goes like, "The wizened youth is me, and I should have said something." Or there was I had like a third option that now just is totally lost for me. It's either fictional Roberto Bolaño, actual Roberto Bolaño, or his conscience sort of saying maybe he should have said something and accounted for what happened.
Yeah, there's another kind of sort of hybrid way of taking it that I only thought about the second time around reading it, which was like, okay, well, if the sick priest says the wizened youth is me, but the wizened youth, as we kind of know already, has a lot of, biographical dates and places and facts that sort of align with Bolaño. I was like, whoa, well, what if this is Bolaño saying that the sick priest is me? And again, it's one of those things where like you have this feeling sometimes when you read him where like the rug has been pulled out from under you and there's like no floor under the rug. There's just like a void. And it's like, okay, maybe. And I still don't know what to do with that, but it's something that's been like lingering with me since then, where like a thing I do think about with Bolaño, and I especially think about it in the context of his return to Chile once kind of democracy was restored. Mm-hmm. I feel you can kind of tell there's sort of like there's a sort of melancholy to it, because he was on I remember listening to like a radio interview he did where someone was asking him like, how come you don't have a Chilean accent? And now, of course, people in other places have sometimes said, oh, no, he sounds very Chilean. Other people, I remember listening to an Uruguayan podcast, and they're like, he sounds like he's from everywhere. And there's this sort of melancholy of like, he lived in so many places, and his sort of, there's a kind of tenuousness sometimes to his relationship to this country that he kind of belongs to. And it's like, is this another way of thinking through a kind of guilt of an author in a certain way, again in this case for something that he didn't really have very much control over, but like I don't know. And again, I really don't know where to go with it, but it's something that's kind of been lingering with me. Like, what if that is the sense of identification?
Yeah.
No, I agree with you, Jeffrey. Like when I finished this book, like the feeling I felt, like the thing that I really felt like Bolaño was trying to communicate through this work was asking the question, how are you like an artist or like a lover of art in the world as it exists?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Like the three of us are here sitting in like our nice warm apartments, comfortably, sipping on our drinks and chatting about this book. And meanwhile, horrors beyond our comprehension are taking place throughout the world. Not necessarily to directly support our lifestyle, but kind of indirectly supporting our lifestyle. Because again, we live in the metropole. It's not really being done for us, but we're kind of getting the runoff of the gold-plated Moloch mech that is American capitalism and imperialism. And we as people who like care about art and literature and whatnot, it's like we like to talk about beautiful things. We might not kind of put it in the platonic sense of like, oh, we're talking about the beautiful, we're talking about the good, but that is kind of what we're doing in a sense. And I think Bolaño is really like asking, like, if he is the priest, like to do this at all in the world as it is kind of to be Father Urrutia, because we are not. By doing this, we are kind of implicitly choosing not to do something about all the horrible things happening in the world. And on some level, that's absurd. Like I kind of said when he's meeting with Pinochet, like Urrutia is not just going to like get up and stab Pinochet. We're not going to end American capitalism and imperialism here with our podcast. Or even if we decided like podcast is done, we're committing our lives to the revolution. Like the three of us aren't going to tear down like the edifice of exploitation. We can dream. But again, it's asking like, okay, then what are we doing here? Like, is there any morality to this, or are we just fooling ourselves? And when we get to the end of our lives, is there going to be this other version of us, this past or this, possible version of us that we chose not to be, that's going to be yelling at us? Like, how could you have done all this? How could you have been complicit in all this so you could talk about books? And like, that is what just, I like, as soon as I finished this book, like I pulled out like my journal and I just like had to write out my feelings about it. And I didn't come to a conclusion. This is the closest to a conclusion I've come to it.
Yeah.
But I think that's really what Bolaño is asking. Clearly, like he made the decision that he, even though he really like lived the more kind of, he lived like the life of like a political exile, but at the same time, like he chose to write books. He didn't, become like a freelance left-wing political assassin or something like that, or a union organizer. He wrote books.
Yeah. Yeah. And, in other things, you can find him talk about how like his country is his family, like his immediate family, and his country is his books as well. And that doesn't exactly kind of square the dilemma you've set up, John, but I think it's good to kind of have that dilemma there. And I think too, the fact that as we get this revelation, the last sentence is, and then the storm of shit begins. And originally he wanted to call the book Shitstorm, which is also incredible. So so maybe he like wants that, like that two-pronged dilemma, and he's like, here it is. Like, and that's like, I can't solve it for you, basically. Like,
like the title of the book, like reading it as like an American, like almost feels like an accusation. It's like, this is what's happening by night in Chile. Like, what are you doing? I'm reading by night in Chile. As I sip my Diet Coke.
Oink,
oink, oink.
The Spanish title is funny on that too, because so Nocturno de Chile, and there's a specific moment actually in the book when Urrutia is on the ship, the transatlantic ship. He reads this book called Nocturno in Spanish. And again, that's that sort of weird moment where like his brain kind of resets, like because he's been so out of sorts. But in the sort of Atlantic crossing, he does a lot of reading, and that's one of the books that is it a book or is it a poem? I don't want to I don't want to assume, but it's a book or a poem that he reads. I think he might even read it out loud, and sort of impresses the people around him.
The Colombians, right, or something about the Colombian strain of the poem, like did not fall upon deaf ears. I think is something he says. Like
that's right.
Like that.
And it's part of the reason why this book is so dense in a way, even though it's not long. Like there's so many moments like this. The Sordello thing is like that too. Like I know we were gonna maybe address that one. Like that almost becomes this like half meaningless, half meaningful refrain, right? That's just repeated over and over. And like, I don't know, maybe we all have our own ways we could have taken it. Like I read somewhere that, cause I was looking, Sordello, and I was like, oh, some article said, oh, Beckett mentions Sordello in Malone Dies and Malloy. And I love the Beckett novels. And I was like, oh, I better see these wonderful Beckett mentions, and they're such Beckett mentions that it's like the narrator says, I was hiding behind a rock like Sordello, and that's it. So Beckett.
Sordello, what Sordello?
Exactly. It's almost like a word that you repeat over and over again until it becomes like nothing, even though it's the name of the poet. But the one thing that I did think was kind of interesting, and this might have been an influence. Malone Dies is also a guy in bed who doesn't move from bed and is like, I'm going to tell you a bunch of things that happen. Here's what's going on in my mind as I think I'm going to die. And that is also the structure of this book. So that could just be a coincidence, but I did wonder about that at the very least.
Yeah. And for me, it made me think of, and I haven't read much Ezra Pound, but in the second canto, he's like listing all of the possible Sordellos, and he's like, Browning Sordello, damn it, I want to talk about mine. And to me, that made me think of when like they're sitting in the cafe and Farewell like gets really depressed all of a sudden, and he's like, there's like this vision where they seem to see shadows of people walking outside, and he's like, they're telling me that there's a multiplicity of readings, and it's almost like this sort of despair at making sense of something, because you could interpret it in so many ways. And I think for maybe LaCroix, he remembers like Farewell mocking him, because like you can almost see it where he's like, "Was Sordello? Which Sordello?" Like he's like doing like a half voice to him, and like for some reason like that stays to him like as like a sort of like this, it can mean anything. It's almost like too much meaning, and like there's a kind of like you said like the void under the rug of like interpreting literature too much or something like that.
Yeah, with
like
Farewell,
the first time they do it, like they bring up Sordello, it's basically like Farewell like quizzing Urrutia, right? He's like asking if he's like read his Dante and his Sordello, and he's like, which Sordello? And that's like kind of a shibboleth to show like, okay, this guy knows his books.
Yeah, it's part of the hazing almost.
Yeah.
Like if he'd said like the wrong thing, like that would have been it. He would have gotten kicked out.
Oh, you mean the guy that hides behind the rock in Beckett?
That Malone Dies comparison makes a lot of sense too, because like in that there's like those walls kind of narration. So
very cool.
Well, Geoffrey, I know you need to be heading out soon, but like we were saying, we always close out with recommendations. Do we want to get onto that?
Yeah, I would love to. The recommendation that I kind of had in mind, really anything that this writer wrote, I would say is well worth people looking into. But unfortunately, most of it has not been translated. So the writer I'm thinking of, there's one book that has actually been translated in English, and also adapted into a movie. The writer I'm thinking of is Pedro Lemebel, also Chilean writer. Very significantly, I think, a writer who did not leave because he could not leave. He was a poor, working class, queer writer from a kind of urban neighborhood of Santiago. And a lot of Lemebel's books are about queer people or like gender nonconforming people, but also people opposed to the dictatorship. And the book, so the book that I kind of have in mind that's been translated in English, the translation is My Tender Matador. The Spanish translation is, or Spanish version is Tengo Miedo Torero, which means like I'm afraid Matador. And it's a really incredible book because it is so much about like how people who were living under the regime were attempting to kind of continue living. The protagonist is in the terms of Latin America in the 1980s described as a travesti, a sort of gender non-conforming, non-binary person. Her name is Loca, and she is in love with a revolutionary student who's trying to blow up Pinochet's car.
Oh, wow.
And this is actually a real assassination attempt that was apparently devised. So again, it's so like incredible on these questions of like political commitment as it applies to the kind of people who were living through the regime, but also with absolutely no, and I think correctly, like no sense of the sort of contradiction of these things. Aesthetically, line by line, so beautiful. Like if you like Nightwood, if you like Juna Barnes, it's kind of prose at that same level, which admittedly was kind of hard for me to read in Spanish, but like it was worth it. Like it really challenged my abilities to read the Spanish because it was about maybe 6 months ago, and I like to think that every month I've got a little better. But you know, again, a person can dream, but like it's so good on that. And like there's a word that when Lemebel came to the US to give a lecture, there was a Spanish language report about this that used the word chispeante, which means like a glittering. And like that's kind of the prose of this book. It's so like beautiful, but again, very, very like clear, and also sometimes really funny because the other characters that are sort of dramatized through this are Pinochet and his wife. It turns out that Pinochet's wife, in a lot of respects, almost has the same tastes as like the sort of people of the queer underworld of Santiago, but she kind of doesn't realize that she does. Like she also loves beautiful things and like, you know, wants to make sure she has like wonderful handbags and like stuff, but she doesn't think it hasn't been like politicized for her. And Pinochet is incredibly vain and like, you know, grows a big mustache so that people take him seriously, and it's rendered so well. So it's a book that's really worth people's time if they're sort of curious about other books kind of from the same period dealing with the same things. It's so good.
But do you want to take the next one, or do you want me to take it? I got one as well.
Real quick, if you one Bolaño recommendation is do read Distant Star, just because it sort of was a version of a bit from Nazi literature in the Americas that Bolaño turned into a novel. Because somebody said, "Do you have any manuscripts lying around?" And he basically just made one. So just like I'll just make this. And so like he fills out the story, and it's sort of like I don't know. It's about sort of like sadistic poetry making and political violence also in Chile. But my other recommendation is something that I wanted for more Bolaño at the time was the Transmigration of Bodies by Yuri Herrera, who is an excellent Mexican novelist. And basically the best way I could sell this book is imagining Refn directing a Mexican war movie about Romeo and Juliet killing each other, and then what do we do with the bodies? And it's incredible. It's 150 pages, and the main character is called the Redeemer in the translation, but in Spanish, I can't remember the exact word, but it's the people who negotiated for Christian hostages during Spanish, like the Moors in Spain, in that area. Like they would take Christian hostages and they'd have Islamic hostages, and there was a guy who would negotiate for them, and he's like the main character. So like
that's so cool.
Yeah, it's really cool. So Transmigration of Bodies, Yuri Herrera. But if you want more Bolaño, definitely read Distant Star.
All right, I am gonna do what you just did, Ben. I'm also gonna recommend Bolaño. Definitely check out Nazi literature in the Americas if you are at all into kind of like metafiction, fake academic, like cyclonopedia, like theory fiction stuff. It's, I think, the best version of that. Unlike Cyclonopedia, it's very funny. I read Cyclonopedia this year, and it was a bit of a slog. But my actual recommendation, I'm going to take a little bit of a left turn. I'm actually going to recommend an English language book that I actually just read this last week, kind of by happenstance. I'm a big believer in synchronicities. Whenever I encounter like an interesting like little tweak there, I always try to follow that. So I visited my uncle this last week. I finished this book while I was visiting him, and I needed something else to read. So I was like kind of scrolling through like my library app looking for something I could get onto my Kindle. And I found a book called A Lush and Seething Hell by John Horner Jacobs, which is it's not a novel. It's a collection of 2 novellas. One of which, the first of the 2, is called The Sea Dreams It Is the Sky, which the best way I can describe it is, what if someone wrote a Lovecraftian horror story about the 8 days that Bolaño was in prison when he went back to Chile during the coup? So clearly very, very like influenced by Bolaño, if not like by Night in Chile itself. Very like interesting book. I think it's really interesting kind of watch it, like reading something that is coming from like an American point of view about this kind of period in history. Kind of it doesn't necessarily change it, but it tweaks it a little bit, because all of a sudden your perspective is just a little different. The way that like American power functions is like a little different. And I think also the idea of like taking this, which is kind of very subtly like a horror novel, and kind of making that more explicit. It's not as good as this, but it was an interesting kind of read to come to like by accident, like right after this.
Yeah, that description sounds very intriguing, John. I'm definitely gonna look that up.
The other novella is also very cool. It's like a lost media kind of story about a guy like finding some old letters from like a Depression era like music, like one of those guys who was like sent on like a trip by like FDR to like go record folk songs in like Western Virginia, and he finds out that one of these folk songs might like be the devil or something. Cool. So very cool. 2 very cool novellas that I liked a lot. Definitely recommend giving that a check out.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah.
Cool.
So Geoffrey, one more thing before we let you go. I understand you just had your first novel published recently. Did you maybe want to plug that for the listeners? Or?
Sure, happy to. So it's almost a year ago now, but we're within the we're within the span of a year. So my book is called Falling Hour. It is out with Coach House Books, which is a Toronto-based press. And the book is, I think, for anyone that enjoys this kind of like interior monologue book where on the surface not very many things happen, but nevertheless kind of dense with like associations. That's the kind of book that it is. Beckett was certainly an influence, in Bolaño and many other writers who are kind of trying to compress a lot of like free associations. And I think, my sort of poetry background kind of like betrays me here a little bit, but it's like it was a lot of fun for me to write, and I've been pleased with sort of nice things people have said about it. So it's something that I think if you like this kind of book with maybe not as many paragraph breaks as you would expect, it is in that family.
Sounds very cool. It's definitely on my list to check out here soon.
Cool.
In the next couple months. So just wanted to say thank you again so much for coming on the show. This was a great conversation.
Thanks so much.
Fun.
Yeah, if you ever want to come on again, just let us know. We'd love to have you back again.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. Well, any other closing thoughts before we call it a night, guys?
Semper Books. Yeah,
Semper Books.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to The Infinite Library. If you liked our show, we hope you'll subscribe and leave us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or the podcast app of your choice. It helps us a lot. If you want to follow us on social media, we can be found on Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky at Infinite Library Pod. If you'd like to contact our team directly with episode ideas or feedback, you can email us at infinitelibrarypod@gmail.com. Our intro music is by Amos Legend in the Forest of Mayhem. Our outro music is by DJ Daggy Diggs, and our logo was created by Lars Noir. You can support our show by supporting them. We hope you'll join us back in the stacks for the next episode soon. Semper Books, bookheads.